These famous paintings are by Claude Monet, and if you're at all like me, you'd like to paint like Monet, or even John Singer Sargent, painting a painting of Monet, while Monet paints like Monet. Man, I'd love to be able to paint like these masters. The problem is I don't like paint, at least not the kind from tubes. It's all too messy for me. Paint gets everywhere and I don't like cleaning it up. I like watercolor pencils though, so much cleaner. Less time cleaning is a win for me. So can you use watercolor pencils to paint like Monet? I'll show you how I'm practicing that very thing with this painting. By the way, I'm using Supercolor watercolor pencils by Caran d'Ache. Maybe my process will give you some ideas of how you can try it too. A lot of people use watercolor pencils on standard watercolor paper, but to make it interesting for this painting, I coated it with gesso. Want to know why? Well, gesso makes the paper less absorbent, makes the pigment sit on top when I wet it, so it's more painterly. Plus it's fun to just try stuff. I applied the gesso with a standard foam roller to keep the surface fairly smooth. Of course, gesso isn't required, but it's fun to experiment with. Don't be afraid to experiment with your own stuff. That would make Monet proud. So this is a reference picture I took last fall in the mountains near me. I decided to crop the image down to something that's shorter and wider. If you paint from a photo reference, take your time on the composition phase. And remember, just because it's in the photo doesn't mean you have to paint it. I'm using a grid method to get the picture sketched onto the paper, but I use dots instead of lines to keep the things cleaner. You'll notice some of those dots in the painting as we go along, but don't worry. You can cover them up or erase them. So here's a sneak peek of where I'm going with the rest of this video. There's a lot of groundwork to painting, so stay with me on the steps I take. I know it's just work in progress pictures, but I think you'll learn something that you can use. Plus, I wanted to try something other than just your typical speed paint video. I usually sketch with a standard mechanical graphite pencil. I'm not worried about having a perfect drawing here. Just good shapes and lines in the right places, really. Graphite isn't water soluble, but the dust can spread around. So after sketching lightly, I roll over it with the kneaded eraser. Okay, finally using some color. I want this first layer of color, or what I call an underpainting, to be soft and somewhat blurry. I also want to start to get the feeling of atmospheric perspective by paying attention to the use of warm and cool colors. Atmospheric perspective is the feeling of depth or distance in a painting. Typically, cool bluish colors appear further away and warm yellowish or reddish colors appear closer. I make the mountains seem to be in the distance here by using a cool bluish purple for them. I try to make the trees and grasses appear closer by using warmer yellows and greens. Again, at this stage, I'm still not worried about details, and the pencil application is pretty light and scribbly. Once we add water, it gets more colorful. I wet the pencil pigment on the paper with a standard watercolor brush, dipped in water. I like to use a fairly big brush at this stage because I'm not looking for details yet, but just base colors and big shapes. Since I'm looking for a blurry underpainting, I'm using a pretty wet brush too. It helps the pigment spread around. But I'm sure to rinse the brush off between each color section so I don't blend the warm and cool colors together too much. But a little bit's okay. I like to think of adding more pencil and water as a new layer. But on subsequent layers, you need to use less water on the brush to avoid removing the first layer of paint. I focus on one area at a time, and for this layer you can see I focused on adding more definition to the mountains and sky. I also darkened some of that middle ground under the bridge with some olive gray color. I continue to repeat the process of drawing with the pencil where needed and then wetting it and spreading it to further develop elements of the painting. For this layer, you can see I started to give more body to the trees by shading. I also added some blue to the stream. I'm using a smaller water brush that is even less wet because I'm getting more detailed. I also added some faint lines here for the beginnings of branches. You can see that my graphite lines are still visible under the wash of color, which in my mind is good because I have some guidelines to build upon in subsequent layers. Okay, the background elements now look pretty much how I want it, and I'm ready to start adding the darker browns and reds on the bridge and the grasses up front. Another element of atmospheric perspective is lighter values with softer edges tend to appear further back, and darker values with sharper edges, like this bridge, tend to appear closer. I wanted to get some lighter or wider highlights on the grasses, and I was able to do that with this electric eraser. This would have been hard to do on regular paper, because the paper might have been torn up or peeled where I erased. With the gesso, it's very durable, and it quickly returned to white when I erased. This electric eraser is pretty cool, and I can do really small, precise spots with it. Okay, I'm nearing the end. You can see that I pushed the values and contrast by making the dark areas darker and the light areas lighter. Sometimes I use water to dilute and make things lighter, but sometimes I use an eraser as I did on the grasses and the ripples in this water. Using eraser tends to leave the sharper edges that I sometimes want. The brush and water method leaves really soft edges. You can also see here that I play with the strengths of watercolor pencil and use it to draw the branches of the trees. I believe it's completely okay to let the pencil marks stay dry to add interesting textures to the painting, like I did with these branches. In this final image, I added a log in the stream and a rock near the bridge. You can also see that while I let the branches largely as pencil strokes, I dabbed a wet water brush over the tops of the willow bushes to add some softness and approximate some smaller branches. Rather than try to paint every branch, I only give the impression of branches and a few leaves. So there you have it. Here were some of the steps I took to paint this impressionistic painting with watercolor pencils. I liked how it turned out. And as always, I learned a bunch. I hope you did too. All right. I hope this art experiment inspired you to explore something in your own art practice. Be sure to watch this next video to get more ideas you can use. And remember, explore art and discover life.